Welcome to Class 11, AP World History. My name is Jason Epand. Today we're going to do the Silk Roads, the end of the Roman Empire, maybe start a bit of Byzantium. First, let's review the questions that I asked at the end of last class. First question I asked was the significance of the Punic Wars to the Roman Empire. The Punic Wars were about the two dominant cultures, not city-states, but two cultures, the two dominant empires of the day, being that of Carthage and that of Rome. They faced, Rome won. Obviously then, Rome takes the spoils of Carthage's defeat. So the Punic Wars set up the Mediterranean to be a Roman lake, and Rome controlling most of the trade that is available in those particular areas. Very much so. Okay? The Punic Wars also showed the indomitability of Rome as a place to invade. Carthage tried twice to actively invade Rome and destroy it, and both times they failed. Okay? So this also created the idea of the Roman Empire as a place of destiny. And for hundreds of years, it was that place of destiny. Today we get into when the destiny is no longer to be. Second question, what was the appeal of early Christian teachings? Okay, early Christian teachings were based on much more of an egalitarian level compared to Roman society, which the small group of people had a lot and the majority of people barely had anything. Remember, one of Jesus' famous quotes is that a camel going through the eye of a needle has a greater chance of getting into heaven than a rich man, or something like that, right? Okay, that's the appeal of it. So it's appealing in a sense to the groups that are not being appealed to by the Roman culture, and that is the lower classes, the urban population, and women. Those groups who are left out, that are subjugated by the Roman Empire's ways. Early Christian teaching as well, it's also, another appeal of it is the idea that the kingdom of God is at hand, that salvation is going to come to us while we are alive. So no longer do we have to deal with the dregs and the dirt and the despair, the destitute quality of society. Rather, the Messiah is going to come, and Christians believe that that Messiah was Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus Christ, and thus they were excited that the kingdom of God was going to be soon at hand, salvation. So those couple things you may discuss. Number three, how did the Republican Constitution set the stage for conflict between patricians and plebeians? That's very simple. The Constitution gave plebeians, a small minority of the population, all the power, while giving the plebeians, the common people, very little say in what happens. Yes, some plebeians were Roman citizens and could vote, but they're voting for someone who typically is of the patrician class, be it the old aristocratic landholding class or the equestrians. Okay? So thus, the Constitution creates the stage for conflict because it doesn't provide any relief for the plebeians. The plebeians later on get the tribunes, and the tribunes very influential within Roman society. Tribune, maybe you notice that certain American newspapers are named for tribunes, for most notably the Chicago Tribune. In the city of Chicago, which is my hometown, by the way. And I highly recommend anyone to go and visit Chicago because it is the most beautiful walking city in the United States in terms of architecture and in terms of grandeur of the buildings. Downtown is beautiful. And nowhere near as dirty as some of those East Coast cities as well. Anyway, that's enough of my proselytizing for Chicago. Now let's go on to today's chapter, which is about first the Silk Roads. Okay, the Silk Roads. What are they? The Silk Roads are the inordinate number of paths and roads that connect the world together, and they were connecting everywhere from Han China over to the Roman Empire, okay? And what would happen is that a trader, for instance, the roads would be conducted in some type of relay race, where, not a race obviously, but a relay, in the sense where an individual or a trader would go on a caravan or go on an overnight type of expedition or over many nights until they reach a certain main town or main emporium warehouse in which they would dump off their goods, they would buy some goods, and they they would go back to their home, and et cetera, et cetera. There's just a variety of relay or basic different cities or towns along the Silk Roads that served as bases from which people can come get goods and drop off goods, obviously buying and selling, et cetera, et cetera. And that's one of the ways the Silk Roads were done. It's not just the roads, it's also sea lanes. Sea lanes join Asia and Africa and Mediterranean basin into one network. And the reason why the Silk Roads are able to be is because what was happening during this era is we mentioned about how the Han Empire was very into expansion. We know about the Roman Empire into expansion. So as empires expanded, it brought everybody closer together. And along with the increased amount of bridges, et cetera, this means that people were able to get to know one another. Not only that, but certain scientific developments. For instance, the Ptolemies coming out of Egypt got to learn about the Indian Ocean and its monsoon system and how it affects the subcontinent of South Asia. And thus, because they knew which ways the winds were going and when the time to travel was, when the time was not to travel was, it just led to a greater efficiency of trade. In terms of the goods themselves, well, obviously, as we know, China is known for its silk and its spices, and those goods tend to travel west. Central Asia, horses. We've mentioned this many times. Horses and jade, and a lot of this stuff ended up going east to serve the Chinese and their empire. And as far as the Roman Empire, they were producing glassware, jewelry, artwork, perfumes, textiles, all of those things were headed further east to indulge the luxuries of the consumers in the East. Okay? What are some of the consequences of the Silk Roads? Well, first consequence is it's obviously going to serve as a basis for the spreading out of ideas. And what you see is Buddhism and Hinduism and Jainism, all of these religions, along with Christianity when it gets its bearing, will soon find a market or will soon be spread out of its original origin. Okay? The most famous religion that was spread along the Silk Roads and became a big success, obviously, is Buddhism. Buddhism going from South Asia, from India, which is its origins, and making its way into China. It was first present among certain of these oasis towns, or emporiums, as I mentioned. Emporium is an Indian term dealing with Indian warehouses on the coast. You could just say oasis towns in Central Asia along Silk Roads. And then it ends up going to the steppes. Remember the steppes of Central Asia? We talked about those before, and then it moves further east. Steppes meaning these like sort of slightly elevated grass and shrubland, stuff like that. Basically, by the 5th century of the Common Era, there are lots and lots of monasteries and missionaries in China when it comes to Buddhism. Let's talk about the spread of Christianity. Christianity spread all around the Mediterranean basin, and one of the ways it did so was having these sort of like extraordinary missionaries who claimed certain powers that Christ himself had, whether it be Gregory the Wonder Worker. He attracted a great deal of converts with his so-called miracle powers. Again, Gregory the Wonder Worker. And by the late 3rd century of the Common Era, the entire Mediterranean is filled with pockets of Christian observers. And there are Christian observers everywhere. In Mesopotamia and Iran by the 2nd century of the Common Era. There are some in Southwest Asia. They're all over the place, okay? Now, it's not just the fact that Christianity is there, but there are many different types of Christianity which are blossoming, okay? Many, many different types, all right? You have Nestorian Christians. Nestorian Christians really emphasize the human nature of Jesus, as do Arians do. We're going to talk about Arians next class, A-R-I-A-N-S. Not Arian with a Y, Arian with an I, A-R-I-A-N. Arian. And that's also another different type of Christianity which really emphasizes Jesus as a human being. We're going to talk about that a little bit later as well. One of the reasons why, like Buddhists and like Jainists that attract different people is because of the missionaries who would go out would purposely lead a ascetic existence. Ascetic, A-S-C-E-T-I-C, a very simple existence, okay? That obviously, you know, someone who withholds from oneself is looked upon as being generous to others quite often, is also someone who is modest, and these are all attractive qualities. Hinduism, obviously not as successful outside of South Asia, India. Why? Because no other nation wanted to accept the caste system. If Hinduism is going to enter your society, then you have to accept the Varna, and you will be placed inside one of the castes. It really did not develop successfully in any of the other countries, except for Ceylon, C-E-Y-L-O-N, which later becomes known as the modern-day country of Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka, of course. Yeah, a little trivia question right there. It wasn't just established religions which spread out. There were also new religions that were popping up all the time. The most famous new religion created by the Silk Roads was Manichaeism. Manichaeism. Let me spell that for you. Manichaeism. Manichaeism was a religion that spread on the Silk Roads, and we don't really like to use the word invented for religions, but it was created, thought of by Mani, M-A-N-I, who was a prophet and who was a Zoroastrian who drew a great deal of influence from Christianity and Buddhism. According to Manichaeism, the world it's similar to Zoroastrianism in that it's a very dualistic world. Always a cosmic struggle between forces of light and forces of darkness, okay? They had very high ethical standards. They advocated an ascetic lifestyle, and maybe it was these demands that made Manichaeism not among the preeminent religions today, because it did have its popularity for a period of time, and people who did see a lot of cruel and inhuman and criminal acts on the Silk Roads would try to promote Manichaeism as a way for everyone to be ethical and treat one another with respect and with dignity. It's successful for a time being, but it never became a foremost religion. It's still around today, though. It'd still be around today. One other term about Manichaeism is that they refer to you would say the priests and the people who make religious doctrine as the elect, E-L-E-C-T, and the people whose job it is, sort of the lay people, the people of their temple or whatever it is, are called the hearers, H-E-A-R-E-R-S. Okay. As far as the people who are attracted by Manichaeism, again, because it preached this high ethical thing, it was high ethical honesty. It very much appealed to merchants during the Silk Roads, et cetera, et cetera. And it was everywhere. They were popular, you could say, in all areas. But then around the time when the Sassanids became in power, and you would say the 3rd or 4th century of the Common Era, even later on the 5th century, they began to persecute. Manichaeists, just as Zoroastrians would then be persecuted by the Muslims starting in the 7th century. Okay, another consequence of the Silk Roads, and this one is not so good, is the spread of epidemic diseases. Big reason to why Western Europe and why Han China all began to contract. And I mentioned this earlier, I was going to talk about this. They got smaller. Their economies got smaller, their populations decreased, et cetera, et cetera. Why? Well, people were dying. Now, why were people dying so much? The reason is because for the first time in, you could almost say, world history, there is a very rapid exchange of goods from one part of the world to the other part of the world. And obviously, many people that lived in one part of the world, their bodies were very susceptible to the germs, bacteria, viruses that would be carried on certain, creatures. We like to blame the rats and the fleas of the world for that. That would, attach themselves to the caravans of certain, boats or certain, wagons, et cetera, that would make their way to another part of the world. Medicine was not strong enough or sophisticated enough to deal with the various issues, and thus we have a catastrophe. Speaking about medicine, I think I forgot to mention something. This is not that important, but just so you know, I forgot to mention something is it Greek time or, yes, Greek time. Hippocrates, the Hippocratic Oath. Here's the guy with medicine. Hippocrates, Hippocrates. He's a dude that deals with medicine and stuff like that. I just remember I forgot to talk about that. Not that it's a huge deal. Anyways, so what we have there is we have certain plagues, like the bubonic plague, really decimating economies because people are dying. And when economies die, productivity also lowers. The Roman Empire, the population dropped by a quarter from the 1st to the 10th century, and the Chinese population dropped a quarter from the 1st to the 7th century CE. So population's going downhill, okay? You have the contraction of large economies, and what you have is pockets or regional economies beginning to emerge, and that always is going to lead to trouble because one economy is going to have a different way of business than another regional economy, and it's not going to be as fluid as when you had a large unifying commodity. Okay, let's now move on. It's now time to talk about the fall of the Roman Empire. Now, when we say fall of the Roman Empire, what we're really saying is the fall of the Western Roman Empire. And I'll talk to you what that means in just a moment, but that's what we're really talking about, the fall of the Western Roman Empire. There are two major reasons, among many. I mean, there's the disease. Disease is a big reason, but there are some other reasons, all right? And I'm going to just list those really quick, and then I'm going to talk about some events. The first is the outstanding militaristic commitment that the Roman Empire had on two fronts. The military of the Roman Empire was everywhere, all right? Not just in the East, but also in the West, in places like Great Britain and Spain and Northern Africa, etc., etc. And after a while, it just grew so difficult. It was so expensive to maintain an army like this. And not just that, but it got to the point that many of these individuals within the Roman Empire, their families, first of all, they weren't Roman, or they weren't even part of any community that had associated with the Roman Empire. So what you have is lots of these, I don't want to say barbarians, but lots of non-Romans entering the Roman army, and yet they have no emotional reason to fight for the army. And this makes a less disciplined army and a less effective fighting force. Okay, that's one. Overextending your military commitment. The second one is because of the fact that Roman productivity was going downhill. Okay? The reasons for this being is that, I mean, part of the reason is that Rome was such a chaotic place of debauchery and mayhem by the 3rd and 4th century due to the rulers who ruled there. But it's not just that. What it also is the fact that the type of wealth that the empire kept on accruing as we head into the Common Era was based on imperial expansion. It was based on plundering the mineral and the precious metals of the regions of which they just conquered. But that's not sustainable. Why? Because if you're not conquering anything new, then there's going to be no new wealth being added to your economy. And if productivity continues to drop as it was in the Roman Empire, this is going to lead to very big economic problems. Okay? As far as where we are politically, in the 3rd century, the Roman peace, let's say, ends. And what we have then is a series of what we call the Barrack emperors. The Barracks emperors, B-A-R-R-A-C-K-S emperors, are a series of generals that seize the throne in between 235 and 284 CE. Now, after 284 CE, there's a new ruler, and his name is Diocletian. Diocletian. And Diocletian rules from 284 to 305 CE. Diocletian is famous for, he's most famous for this, let's say. It is Diocletian's decision to divide the empire into two administrative districts. Yes, when I was talking about the Western Roman Empire at the beginning of this little montage about the Roman Empire, or at the beginning of this chapter, or at the beginning of this section, I should say, this is what I was referring to, the downfall of the Western Roman Empire. Because Diocletian divides the Roman Empire in between the West, which is the Roman Empire, and the East. Where the East is going to be, well, that's going to be figured out by the next emperor. Okay? Now, according to Diocletian, each of the Roman empires, the West and East, will have a co-emperor, ruled each district, and with the aid of a powerful lieutenant. And I guess, you know, from there, whoever's going to be in the Eastern Roman Empire, the government would fill itself out with some members of the local population. Okay? It's the following empire, Constantine, who I think he's Constantine's father, I think, was the emperor for a very short period of time, and then Constantine took over. But, you know, regardless, Constantine, it's in the very early 4th century, is the person who decides upon and starts building Constantinople. That's right, Constantinople, C-O-N-S-T-A-N-T-I-N-O-P-L-E, Constantinople, okay? Constantinople, the new city upon which the Eastern Roman Empire is going to be built upon, all right? Now, what are some other reasons for the downfall of the Western Roman Empire? Another reason is because because the Roman Empire is not as good at subjugating certain barbarians that are not part of the Roman Empire. The ones I'm referring to now are the Germanic barbarians. There are lots of different Germanic tribes that are located north of the Roman Empire, north and a bit east of the Roman Empire. There are so many of them, and I'm going to talk about them at a later point. I'm going to list some of them out there for you, okay? But what happens is that these Germanic migrations, they're beginning to migrate south and a little bit to the west, which is they're hitting the northern point of the Roman Empire. Some of these Germanic peoples are of the peaceful variety. I'll give you an example. The Visigoths. V-I-S-I-G-O-T-H-S. The Visigoths, I mean, all these Germanic populations, they had an army at one time, but the Visigoths, they assimilated into the Roman Empire. They were, and they were settled agriculturalists, which means that they were settled in one place and they were farmers, okay? What they did and what the Roman Empire did is that they granted the Visigoths land on the periphery of the Roman Empire, meaning on just in its outer edges. And this was an intelligent move because then there is a buffer between the actual Roman Empire and barbarians not even associated with the Roman Empire. And the Visigoths lived there and they did okay there for over a century. They adopt Roman law, they adopt Christianity, and so they assimilate quite easily. Okay? Unfortunately, other Germanic barbarians are not as peace-loving. One of these groups are the Huns. The Huns. Now we know about the White Huns, and of course we know about Attila the Hun. God, that's a ghastly name and a ghastly thing, okay? Until under the Huns' pressure, the Germanic people began forcing their way into, or I should say, under the Hun pressure, the people who were on the periphery, the Visigoths and other individuals, part of the Roman Empire, who were on the edges of the Roman Empire, begin to feel the heat coming from these these barbarians, these violent barbarians who are going to cause them a great deal of harm, and they begin to move closer to the center of the city. Now, obviously, for protection, right? But obviously, as they begin to move closer into the city, it's becoming more and more crowded, and people are interfering on people's lands, and it's just causing chaos, and because of the Roman army overextending their militaristic commitment, they cannot send a fresh legion of troops directly to counter the charge of these Huns. And eventually what happens is that the Huns make their way through, they destroy a great deal of the Roman Empire, and then finally a Germanic emperor by the name of Odovacer, O-D-O-V-A-C-E-R, O-D-O-V-A-C-E-R, deposes the Roman emperor in 476 of the Common Era. So 476 CE, end of the Western Roman Empire. The end. That's it. The Eastern Roman Empire in Constantinople, though, is going to survive. It does survive, and it will survive for almost the next 1,000 years. Yeah, almost the next 1,000 years, the Eastern Roman Empire is going to survive and do okay. But the Western Roman Empire, in Rome itself, Rome proper, 476 CE, Odovacer says, bye-bye. Bye-bye. Bye-bye, Roman king. Now, let's go on. Think to yourself, what was the main survivor of the Western Roman Empire? Think of it. The answer, of course, is Christianity. Christianity is the most prominent survivor of the collapse of the empire, without a doubt. Sometimes certain historians, like Edward Gibbon, Gibbon, who wrote a very famous Fall of the Roman Empire, or the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, blamed Christianity, and, or I should say, he said the triumph of Christianity and the horrors of barbarians causes the end of the Western Roman Empire, which is a little bit true, but there's the military thing he's a bit ignoring. Anyways, the point is Christianity is the #1 survivor. Okay? How does Christianity become accepted? Well, Constantine in 313 CE created the Edict of Milan, M-I-L-A-N, like Milan, the city, which I believe in 2016 will host the next World's Expo. This year it was in Shanghai. Anyways, I think it's 2016, but anyways, the Edict of Milan. The Edict of Milan legitimizes Christianity. Now it is perfectly acceptable to publicly worship Christianity, to worship Christ. Before 313, it depended on where you lived. Some Romans found it to be extremely offensive to the state cult and to whatever type of idea that they worshipped, be it the deities like Jupiter and Mars and Venus, or be it like the other mystery religions and salvation cults. Okay? However, now 313 CE, it's legitimate, period. Theodosius, Theodosius, proclaims Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire in 380 CE. So very late on in the Roman Empire, this Emperor Theodosius made Christianity the official religion. Now it's the #1 religion, there's no doubt about it. So now it's firmly entrenched within the Roman Empire and it's going to survive. Another person, so it's not just these official acts of government which allow for the growth of Christianity, it's also certain types of Christian philosophers and intellectuals who are beginning to write upon and expound upon the ideas of Christ, and also their words are greatly influential to certain people as well. One of the most famous is St. Augustine, okay? St. Augustine tried a rather intellectual approach with a couple of his books. He wrote a book called City of God, which basically discusses Paul's concept of sin and of grace. And then you've got a book called Confessions, which basically criticizes human nature as being very, very corrupt, and that salvation in and of itself is very hard to get. And this is actually, Confessions ends up being very influential to the Calvinists of the Reformation, because Augustine discusses something called predestines. And predestines, P-R-E-D-E-S-T-I-N-E-S, are all about the fact that some people are going to be saved, but others it's just going to be an impossibility. All right? And these are some of the ideas that Augustine discussed, and many different, there are other Christian philosophers out there at the time who, again, wrote in an attempt to spread the religion by connecting to people's minds, not just their hearts, As time goes on, the church itself becomes increasingly institutionalized. Now, when we use the word church today, we're referring to some type of system or some type of bureaucracy. But remember, back then, there was many different types and sects, S-E-C-T-S, and strains of Christianity, okay? But over time, a couple of them started merging into one, okay? So although there's conflicting doctrines and practices, over time, a standardized hierarchy of church officials begins to become formed, and certain ideas are beginning to merge into one. And sometime, I'm trying to think exactly when it was. You don't have to know. Besides, all throughout this course, when you hear me giving you years, I'm doing it for your benefit. It's not like on a test you're going to say, the year that Odovacer conquered Rome. Was it 474, 475, 476, 477, 478 of the Common Era? You'll never get that, okay? I just like to provide you years for your own benefit, okay? But anyways, sometime, I don't remember exactly when it was, and I'm sorry, but sometime the full hierarchy is created so that a bishop of Rome was elected. And the bishop of Rome today is known as the Pope. And the first Pope was Peter, P-E-T-E-R. And he obviously then became the spiritual leader of what is now known as Roman Catholicism. Roman Catholicism, Catholic, is one of the three major strains of Christian thought. Next chapter, we're going to be talking about the second one, and the third one doesn't come around until, you would say, the 15th century. Okay? So as the Roman Empire is collapsing and as chaos is running rampant, the foundation for Christianity, for a stable Christianity and a stable people, is firmly in place. Absolutely in place. All right? And that is why it is the survivor of the Western Roman Empire, because it was already established by the time the Germanic barbarians conquered Rome, and what's the word I'm thinking? Plunder, and there's another word I was going to come up with. Anyways, destroyed Rome, the Western Roman Empire. Okay? And that's the chapter for today. Let me ask you some quick questions. I'm going to ask you some questions, and I'll talk about them next class. Number one, what goods from what regions traded along Silk Roads? Number two, what were the long-term effects of the spread of disease? And number three, what are some of the main causes of decay and downfall of the Western Roman Empire? Again, what goods and from what regions traded along Silk Roads? Number two, what were the long-term effects of the spread of disease? And number three, what were some of the main causes of decay and the downfall of the Western Roman Empire? Thank you very much for listening. Next class, Byzantium. We're going to answer these questions, and perhaps we will begin chapter 14, which is Islam. Thank you so much. Goodbye.